One was poised and serious, the other irascible and flamboyant. One headed a commonwealth of nations, and the other was looking for her own way in life. It has been said that the two sisters could not be more contrasting. They had grown up in a world of nobility, deference, and aristocracy. They were different from each other from a very young age, and that did not change with time. The Queen had a great responsibility, but Princess Margaret did not have to think about such things. She chose a different path in life. Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret are some of the most popular women in the history of the time. All their social outings attracted the attention of the whole country and are known all over the world. But what were they really like? What was hidden behind the publicity? Elizabeth was a typical representative of both the old England she grew up in and the rapidly changing new world she adapted to. As for Princess Margaret, it has always been difficult to determine which part of her life was royal and which part was rebellious. They were different from an early age, and this did not change over time. The Queen always treated her sister reverently. There has always been a strong affection between them that has endured through different times in their lives. Elizabeth was born on April 21, 1926 in the quiet London neighbourhood of Mayfair, and 4 years later, Margaret was born during a storm in rural Scotland. Their parents were the Duke and Duchess of York, namely Albert and Elizabeth. Albert, or as he was called, Bertie, was the second son of King George V. Elizabeth was a quiet, serious child, loved dogs and horses from childhood, just like her grandfather, King George V. Margaret, on the other hand, is a completely different character. Of the two girls, Margaret stood out as the more cunning, jocular, and mischievous. Elizabeth is by no means a simpleton, but she lacked the sociable nature of her sister. Elizabeth is a serious child with a natural love of neatness and order. Margaret even from childhood attracted attention to herself with her liveliness and cheerfulness. Her father never scolded her. She was a mischievous, restless child, and was well developed for her age. The girl's father always said that Lilibeth was his pride and Margaret his joy. He always admired Princess Margaret's beauty, and could not believe that he had given birth to such a pretty child. The public life of the princesses began early. We have seen the very young princesses and her family attend Scottish banquets. As daughters of the king's second son, Elizabeth and Margaret never imagined that they would one day be the center of the world's attention. First, no one expected the Duke and Duchess of York to ascend the throne or Princess Elizabeth to do so. Secondly, there was always the possibility that the girl's parents would have more children, and a boy heir had a better chance of being heir to the throne than Elizabeth. So it was unlikely from the start that Elizabeth would become queen. Albert and Elizabeth, the princess's parents, had a quiet family life. But Elizabeth and Margaret were destined to live comfortably in the shadows only until 1936. The next king was to be their uncle, Prince David, a charming bachelor. However, everything changed when King George V died at Sandringham on January 20, 1936. The king had been having health problems for some time. The king's health problems had been known since the First World War, when he fell from his horse during a troop review in France. He had a lung disease. The disease was progressing and there was no improvement. The man who was with the king until the last moment of his life was his doctor. This doctor would later claim that he was forced to administer a lethal dose of morphine to ease his suffering. In other words, the doctor committed euthanasia. The king's death was reported in this morning's Times. The next king, as expected, was Elizabeth and Margaret's uncle David. He took the throne. The king was now Edward VIII. However, there was a problem, which was that the new king did not want the throne. On the contrary, the thought was driving him to confusion, and the fact was that the king was in love with the relaxed, bold and charming Wallis Simpson, a divorced American. She embodied the glamour of the new world and attracted Edward with her ease and looseness. However, This sympathy did not apply to the rest of the family. Wallis had been divorced twice, which was unheard of in English royalty and high society. She was not accepted by Edward's family and entourage. The king couldn't say out loud that he didn't really want to be king, and it really depressed him. Obviously, he also realized that no one would allow his favorite woman, with 2 living ex-husbands, to be queen, and therein lay a huge problem. The head of state, who is also a defender of the Anglican faith by tradition, goes through a coronation ceremony, and that is tantamount to ordination. It is a real anointing. It all requires total commitment. It means, to some extent, that you are no longer completely separate from yourself and your own interests. You serve the state, and he realized he wasn't ready for that. Marrying a divorced woman was very hypocritical. It was against the rules. It was unacceptable at the time. And was he up to the job of monarch? Because he was impatient. His vision and perception of situations, especially with regard to the industrial conflicts that engulfed the empire and the country, did not match the behavior of a monarch. Moreover, George V is said to have believed that if Edward became king, he would destroy himself within a year and the future would be bleak. There was a constitutional crisis in England of which the public knew nothing. There was a ban on disclosure to the press. All the king's love affairs were kept secret, and the end of this situation was as follows: the king abdicated the throne, because he could not refuse the woman he loved. December 11, 1936, Edward abdicated. And what really pushed him to this step? Love or unwillingness to fulfill the duty of a monarch? Or maybe just an inability to serve the interests of the state? Or perhaps all these reasons together, it is not clear. He was king for less than a year. It was shocking, and most people saw it as a dereliction of duty. People's opinions were divided. Some felt that Edward should have stayed and been allowed to marry Wallis Simpson. Others felt that Edward was worthless. And there were those who believed that Wallis Simpson had saved the monarchy from an incompetent king. At that moment, Elizabeth and Margaret's lives were turned upside down. Crowds gathered in front of Bertie's house on Piccadilly. When Edward VIII abdicated in 1936, the throne passed to Bertie, Elizabeth and Margaret's father. He became George VI and was crowned on May 12, 1937, at Westminster Abbey. The girl's father was totally unprepared to be king. It is said that he compared himself to a lamb being sent to the slaughter. According to tradition, he could not use his worldly name, but had to use one of the middle names. He chooses the name George, even though there were already 5 Georges and the previous monarch was also named George. By doing so, he wanted the name to symbolize stability after the chaos caused by the abdication crisis. In this way, he wanted to stabilize and balance the situation. The Duke of York realized that he would have to take responsibility. He became king with no experience of public service and was unprepared. Unlike his brother, in this situation, King George realizes that he must now prepare his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, to become the next monarch. Since 1938, Elizabeth has been studying under Henry Martyn, who is vice-rector of Eton College. Her father begins to familiarize the future queen with the daily chores involved in handling official documents. In the past, the girls received a similar education, but now everything was different. However, Margaret was not affected by these changes. She continued to learn the wisdom of a noble maiden, perfecting her manners as a girl destined for marriage. Singing, piano lessons, and French were far more important to her than constitutional history or complicated theological courses. The coronation of the girl's father was a defining event that emphasized the abilities the girls already possessed, Elizabeth's sense of duty and Margaret's frivolous passions. However, they were still siblings, and their bond never weakened. The world outside the walls of the girls' school is changing and in crisis. The invasion of Nazi Germany leads to a crisis in Europe. For their own safety, Elizabeth and Margaret are advised to evacuate. However, The royal family needed to make it clear that they were not fleeing the threat of Nazi Germany, but were staying put. The king needed the queen to be by his side. The queen and her daughters were not going to leave. They were all together. It was a very powerful message. Wartime is displayed in British story plots with a smiling queen followed by princesses on bicycles. Later, the queen decides that the princesses must be taken to Windsor Castle for safety for a short while. As Princess Margaret later said, "We were supposed to go there for 5 days, but we stayed there for 5 years." The castle looked gloomy at the time, without the usual decorations, but the color camouflage now hid it in the darkness. The sounds of explosions in London traveled far from the castle, and the girls were safe. As the girls grew older, the war was still going on. As Elizabeth grew older, she took on more and more social responsibilities, and when she turned 18 in 1944, she joined the Territorial Auxiliary as a mechanic driver. The princess now dresses in work overalls. The king then insists that Elizabeth be treated the same as the other trainees in the Territorial Auxiliary. The story captures snippets of Elizabeth being at a training camp in the south of England, and her parents and sister Margaret come to visit. She shows them how she knows how to handle fan belts and spark plugs. The princess is in the Women's Auxiliary Corps and Territorial Service along with ordinary girls. Obviously, this is done to show everyone that members of the royal family are no different from regular people, and don't put themselves above everyone else. The royal family are just like everyone else. Elizabeth gained experience driving an ambulance there, learned mechanical skills and revolver shooting. It was propaganda, no doubt. But nevertheless, the fact that the charming young princess had something to do with frontline work helped to raise the morale of the country, and people appreciated it. She appreciated it herself. In July 1939, at the age of 13, the Queen visited the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, where she was introduced to the handsome Prince Philip. The handsome and attractive Prince Philip understandably caught Elizabeth's attention. She was enchanted by him, and 3 years later, when Philip was on vacation, they spent Christmas together, and have been corresponding regularly ever since. But Elizabeth's parents, the King and Queen, did not approve. They were not happy with the young people's companionship. The king was suspicious of Philip, and members of the royal family thought that everything was happening too fast. How could they let him marry his daughter, who was only 21 years old? The king clearly did not like the idea of his daughter's marriage. However, Elizabeth had been fascinated by Prince Philip since she was 13 years old. Elizabeth's parents still hoped that it was just an early crush that would soon pass. But things turned out differently, and on November 20th, 1947, Elizabeth and Philip were married in Westminster Abbey. Sister Margaret was one of the bridesmaids. The wedding was attended by about 3,000 guests. Considering that the wedding took place during times of austerity, it was very lavish. Food was still being rationed, and the princess couldn't claim any privileges at the time, but her dress was gorgeous, no worse than any other royal bride. The wedding was the first major royal event for the king and queen since their accession to the throne a decade earlier. Winston Churchill later called the wedding a flash of light. November 14, 1948, Elizabeth gave birth to a son, Charles. Then, over the next 16 years, the fruits of this marriage would be 3 more children. This meant that Margaret was no longer a candidate for the throne. With the arrival of Philip and the birth of her children, Margaret clearly realized that her sisterly relationship with Elizabeth had changed. She did not seem to want to be queen, nor did she aspire to be. One can see that Margaret rejoiced in her sister's marriage. Being a member of the royal family meant constant fulfillment, and perhaps Margaret always had that little sister feeling. Her father, the king's health, deteriorated in the post-war years, and the sisters took over most of the king's official duties. In September 1951, King George VI was diagnosed with a malignant tumor in his left lung and underwent surgery to remove it. The king was not told he had cancer, and there was no cure for the disease. He died on the morning of February 6, 1952, at the age of 56. At the time of her father's death, Elizabeth was in Kenya on a visit to Australia. The king always regarded Elizabeth as his protégée and Margaret was his delight. For Princess Margaret, losing her adored father was a nightmare. She was left without a purpose. When he died, both daughters were saddened, but Elizabeth's sense of duty overpowered her grief. Then, Elizabeth left England as a princess and returned as a queen, and her future was set. And what did Margaret's future hold? Queen Elizabeth's coronation took place on June 2, 1953. Westminster Abbey was closed for several months during the preparations. On the day of the coronation, millions of people crowded the streets of London. The coronation marked the end of austerity. Elizabeth ushered in a new era. Her aim was to strengthen Britain's position in a post-war world where everything had changed forever, and a stylish young queen would lead the British people into a bright future. Invited guests arrived in carriages to the Admiralty Arch. Among them was Churchill, who watched the spectacle from the carriage window. Elizabeth's coronation was a colorful event. It was the first time the coronation was televised. At the time, Britain was still in a state of post-war austerity, and not all ordinary people had television sets. Even 8 years after the defeat of Germany, some goods were still sold on coupons. On the international stage, Britain's imperial and military power had diminished. Nevertheless, the nation was enveloped in celebration. But behind the pageantry and solemnity lay family passions, strife and scandal. While preparing for her coronation, Margaret surprised Elizabeth. She chose a man named Peter Townsend to marry her. He was a military pilot. During the war, King George VI decided to honor soldiers who had distinguished themselves on the battlefield by giving them the honorary title of Staumeister for a period of 3 months. This honor was bestowed upon Captain Peter Townsend as an outstanding pilot. The king and Townsend became very close friends, and the king called him the son he never had. When the king died in 1952, Townsend's position became uncertain, but the royal family did not want to lose him. All the ladies of Buckingham Palace and court had their eyes on this brilliant young man, but it was Princess Margaret who truly fell in love with him. Understandably, after her father's death, she was more attached to him than she should have been. They became especially close when he comforted Margaret after her grief. The princess was devastated by her father's death, and he was close to her and sympathized with her. Like his sister's husband, he was a hero, and people love heroes. Townsend was divorced and was 16 years older than Margaret. If that didn't bother Margaret, others weren't so happy about it. He was married and had 2 sons from that marriage. This was a problem for public life at the time. According to a law passed in 1772, all members of the royal family had to get the monarch's permission to marry, and Margaret was no exception. Elizabeth was not initially against the marriage, but asked Margaret to wait a while after the coronation until things were back to normal. She then gave Margaret hope. However, when Elizabeth discussed this with her private secretary Alan Lassens, the latter was shocked and advised Elizabeth to send Townsend abroad. Elizabeth had to choose between her love for her sister and her social and religious obligations. She loved Margaret and wanted her to be happy. This decision was incredibly difficult for her. With few exceptions, all politicians, including Winston Churchill, advised against the marriage. In other words, duty took precedence over personal feelings. The Queen is a defender of the Church of England's faith. The Church of England did not recognize divorce. The Queen agreed to send Townsend abroad, and Townsend was appointed heir attaché in Brussels. Townsend was so overwhelmed by the appointment that he did not even have time to say goodbye to Margaret, who was on a royal visit to Africa at the time. Margaret was devastated by the news, and depressed at the thought that even her own sister could not help her. Even though she was the Queen, they continued to write to each other, convinced that all they had to do was wait. If Margaret and Townsend waited 2 more years, the princess would be 25 years old, after which the royal family could petition Parliament to allow her to marry. If both houses of Parliament agreed, they could enter into a civil marriage. It seemed like a great plan. Presumably they considered it as the main option. August 1955 would have been Margaret's 25th birthday. The press was counting down the days, and there was much talk that Margaret was about to announce her engagement. But nothing was heard on her birthday. Later, no engagement announcement came either. Finally, On October 31, 1955, Margaret issued a press statement saying that her relationship with Townsend was over and there would be no wedding. It was stated that Princess Margaret had decided not to marry Captain Peter Townsend. It was later said that she had put duty and religion above following her sister's example. The Queen Mother supported her daughter's decision. The most popular version was that the Prime Minister and the clergy threatened to deprive her of her maintenance and title if she married Peter Townsend. However, the government under Anthony Eden had a different policy and instead of opposing the marriage, gave Margaret and Peter Townsend a chance to marry if they still wanted to. This way Margaret could keep her status as princess, and if she wanted to marry Peter, she would lose nothing but her status as heiress. Although they didn't want Princess Margaret to become a martyr, it wasn't government pressure that ended the relationship between Margaret and Captain Townsend. It was much simpler than that. Among the documents published by the National Archives is a secret letter from Margaret to Anthony Eden, the gist of which was that she had no doubt that her love for Peter was no longer strong enough to marry, and the feeling is mutual. In other words, feelings between the couple had cooled, but if Elizabeth thought her sister would find someone more suitable, she was in for a disappointment. The era of world domination was over. Prime Minister Anthony Eden had been removed, and the country's role on the world stage was no longer significant. Queen Elizabeth epitomized stability during these difficult times. In the 50s and early 60s, Princess Margaret supported her sister by taking on royal duties. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was free to attend to other matters. She now looked like a spectacular and modern lady. She began to smoke in public and always carried an elegant long cigarette case, actively led a social life, participated in many events. Princess Margaret had a reputation as a party girl, and indeed she was. But she did not forget to fulfill her duties as a member of the royal family. In 1957, Margaret became president of the Royal New Ballet, reflecting her passion for theater and the arts. Margaret was now in no hurry to marry, even though she was almost 30 years old, and in 1957, former lover Peter married a young woman. She was Belgian, and some noted that she was similar to Margaret in appearance. Apparently, after this news, the princess surprised everyone by announcing her engagement as well. The chosen one was Anthony Armstrong Jones. Everyone was surprised that he was not the usual couple for the royal family. He came from a wealthy family, graduated from Eton and Cambridge, but had no official title or property. Everyone was surprised by his occupation. He was a photographer. Margaret took full advantage of the social changes in society, which actively began to occur in her time, and began to make acquaintances not with aristocrats, but with the bohemians. Previously, this had been unthinkable for members of the royal family. Margaret's acquaintance with the chosen one took place at a dinner party, at which among the invited guests was Tony Armstrong Jones. Princess Margaret had never met him before. Apparently, under the influence of Anthony Armstrong Jones, Princess Margaret was plunged into another life with which she had not previously been familiar. Anthony Armstrong Jones arrived on a motorcycle and took the princess with him to an apartment he was renting. Margaret rode with Tony, hidden under black-rimmed glasses and rolled up in a scarf. The princess would later recall the apartment as the most romantic place. The apartment had a large window overlooking the Thames, with a view of the docks on the right and a view of Tower Bridge and St. Paul's Cathedral on the left. Their romance was kept secret, so when Princess Margaret and the photographer announced their engagement in February 1960, the whole country was surprised. Their wedding took place on May 6, 1960 at Westminster Abbey and was the first royal wedding to be televised worldwide. Millions of people watched the wedding. As an older sister, Elizabeth was delighted that Margaret had found womanly happiness and found love. But as queen, she clearly recognized that Armstrong Jones was a man out of their league. He gave Margaret the status of a rebel. At that time, Princess Margaret became very popular and everything she did or wrote became news. Her wedding was a big event for everyone. Everyone was thrilled with the lavishness of the wedding. Princess Margaret's wedding dress was designed by Norman Hartnell and the Poltimore tiara was flaunted on her head. Margaret had 8 bridesmaids led by her niece, Princess Anne. Princess Margaret was beautiful. He was a talented photographer and everything looked very modern. Everything was incredibly beautiful. The audience was mesmerized by it all. However, despite the beauty and the birth of 2 children over the next few years, the marriage soon reached a crisis point. Mutual infidelity, drug and alcohol abuse led to the breakup of their relationship. It was a collision of 2 worlds. Armstrong-Jones' bohemian lifestyle and his liaisons on the side, and Margaret's desire not to lose her wealth and royal prestige. They were very close, but she was royalty and he wasn't. But he was in control. Everything went from bad to worse. The tabloids and media need scandals and are willing to make them up, and Margaret is a royal scandal to look forward to. He could always get away with it without public condemnation. She could not. On March 19, 1976, it was officially announced that Margaret and Anthony had separated. More Princess did not marry, although she had many men, the most famous lover, because of which, as they say, and there was a divorce from Tony, was Roddy Llewellyn, a British aristocrat and a specialist in garden design. But, without a doubt, all her life Princess Margaret loved only one man, Peter Townsend. Already in 1995, when she learned that Peter was dying, he had stomach cancer, Margaret came to his house, and sitting at his bedside, she had a long conversation with him about something. As she left, the princess told Peter's wife that he was still the same as before, only grayer than before. Even then, in 1976, the media's reverential attitude to the royal family was already a thing of the past, and the newspapers gleefully described the breakdown of Margaret's marriage. This was not the only change that occurred in England during Elizabeth's reign. By 1977, and the 25th anniversary of her reign, the class distinctions of the past had disappeared and social taboos were almost non-existent. The British Empire had become an organization of nations united by the Crown and Elizabeth. Elizabeth led the monarchy and the country through times of crisis and triumph, while Margaret remained aloof. She was an iconic figure in the 1950s and 1960s, but over time her fame faded. Margaret was called the English Rose. So pretty was she, and her full name sounded like Margaret Rose. But the princess passed away a deeply unhappy and sickly woman. Like her father, Margaret had been an avid smoker for most of her life and bore the consequences. Her health had begun to decline as early as the late 1980s. She started smoking as a teenager and continued to abuse smoking for most of her life. In the 70s, Margaret suffered a serious nervous breakdown and was treated for depression. At the funeral, the Queen showed strong emotions, her eyes sincerely reflecting her grief. It was difficult for her to accept the death of her sister. Her sister's death was a blow to the Queen, and 7 weeks later her mother died as well. On the one hand, Princess Margaret's active and happy life was also very tragic and unhappy. She was an emotional and troubled woman. Yes, she didn't have the responsibility of a sister, but she didn't have the confidence of a sister either. Margaret pushed boundaries and set precedents. This allowed the young royals to breathe free and lead more normal lives. Margaret was a staunch supporter of the royal family, did her duty and lived life to the fullest. She had many interesting friends, went to the ballet, theater, read books and was interested in many things. She loved music and was never bored in life, helping to modernize the royal family and bring it into the new age of the 20th century. 2 sisters, 2 different destinies. Margaret was a reflection of a new whole era, and her sister, Queen Elizabeth, created it.